Morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Fixing the UK Fiscal Framework, A Path to Sustainable Growth. Today, we have three speakers with us. Gemma Tetlow is the Chief Economist of the Institute for Government. She leads the Institute's work on public finances and contributes to economics-related work across the Institute. She's a regular commentator on the radio and television, including BBC Radio 4, Times Radio, ITV News and Sky News, and in the print media. She's also, I should say, one of the governors of the National Institute. So very pleased that she's with us this morning. We also have Helen Thomas. Helen is the CEO of Blonde Money, which is a consultancy that she set up almost a decade ago with Richard Brownlees to bring together the worlds of Westminster and Wall Street. Given her experience working in the bond markets, we're very interested to hear what she has to say today. Finally, I'm joined by Adrian Pabst, who's the Deputy Director for Public Policy here at the National Institute. The way this is going to work is each of our speakers is going to speak for around 8 to 10 minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions from the floor. If you would like to ask a question, can I suggest that you put it into the webinar chat, and then once all of our speakers have spoken, I will call on people to ask their questions. We'll unmute you and enable you to do that. I think that's all the housekeeping for now. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Gemma Tetlow.
Thanks very much, Stephen. So my remarks mainly based on some work that we did and published in a paper last February. And the reason we ended up writing a paper on fiscal rules and fiscal frameworks was because there had been a lot of growing criticism really from across the political spectrum about the fiscal rules and the outcomes they were driving. And so we thought it was worth looking at this question in more detail, sort of give you the punchlines of where we got to, and I think where I still am. We ended up concluding that there are lots of problems with fiscal policy outcomes in the UK, but that they aren't the fault of rules per se. And in fact, we feel that there are reasons why you do need something that look like fiscal rules to help manage government policy, but that there are problems with the wider fiscal framework and the way that fiscal rules have been implemented in practice in the UK. And so we had put forward some ideas for how you might improve the way that they actually operate in practice. So to go through each of those parts in a bit more detail, we identified 6 common problems with the operation of fiscal rules in the UK. So first one of those being that it has at times driven an inappropriate macroeconomic stance. So at times when, during the 2010s, when interest rates were at or close to the zero lower bound, and there was no further scope for monetary policy to provide stimulus, fiscal rules at that time were perhaps inappropriately constraining in not allowing fiscal policy to provide a stimulus. Conversely, roll forward to 2022 when we had the big energy price shock, interest rates were, the Bank of England was battling to keep inflation under control, and at the same time, the government, because it had at the time pretty lax fiscal rules, at least in terms of constraining near-term borrowing, the government was able to do significant fiscal stimulus, providing a lot of support to households and businesses with energy costs at that time, which maybe was pushing against what the Bank of England were trying to do on interest rates. Second problem is short-termism, that fiscal rules have tended to drive governments to do things which look like they save money in the short term, but perhaps have negative longer-term consequences or don't adequately weight the longer-term benefits of policies. Third problem, perceived arbitrariness, that sometimes decisions seem to be made purely as a way of meeting the fiscal rules, but which seem to drive quite arbitrary choices about not going ahead with or going ahead with policies that are either bad or good in their own terms. Fourth problem was gaming. So successive governments have done things which help them to meet the letter, but not really the spirit of their fiscal rules. This has most obviously happened when governments have been trying to meet debt targets. So things like previous governments selling off the student loan book for less than it was actually really worth. That boosted the headline measure of debt that government was targeting at the time, but not in a way that actually fundamentally improved the fiscal sustainability of the UK. Chancellor have also been prone to fiscal fine-tuning, so fiscal forecasts move around a lot. It's very easy to lose or gain £15 billion in your fifth year forecast for borrowing when you're talking about the difference between £1 trillion of spending and £1 trillion of revenues. But the problem in practice has been, particularly because chancellors have tended to give themselves very limited headroom against their fiscal targets, that when those forecasts change, they've then been driven to tweak fiscal policy very frequently to just stay within their rules. So you get this very inappropriate fine-tuning of fiscal policy in response to changes in inherently uncertain fiscal forecasts. And the final problem we identified, which is closely related to gaming, but we sort of distinguish this as being a slightly different behaviour, is what we described as fiscal fiction. And so this is the tendency of governments where they have forward-looking fiscal rules, which only bind, say, in the fifth year of the forecast, to pencil in policies for later years that really they have no intention or realistic chance of actually implementing. And the two major ones that we've seen of that in recent years is, firstly, penciling in spending cuts for later years that are really inconsistent with government's stated ambitions for public service quality. And the second big one has been constantly assuming that governments are going to increase fuel duties at some point in the future, even though every time it comes to the crunch of having to do that, they put off the date at which that happens. But we've constantly had these sort of fuel duty increases in the forecasts helping to meet these rules, even though they never actually happen. As I said, we concluded that actually fiscal rules per se are not the problem. There are good reasons to have some kind of fiscal objective to guide government's behaviour. The UK does face some kind of borrowing limit. It can't borrow inexorably and have debt rising forevermore. So there is some kind of fiscal limit that the government needs to act within. Politicians also inherently face a deficit bias. It's always more attractive to spend more and tax less in the short term because you benefit voters today, but that's coming at the cost of voters further down the line. So something to kind of act against that is beneficial. And the third reason, which perhaps is less obvious to people outside government, but within government itself, these fiscal rules can play quite an important, useful role for the Treasury in making clear to other parts of government what those fiscal constraints are. So the Treasury is really the only part of government that has at the forefront of its mind the cost in terms of needing to raise revenue of extra spending commitments, whereas most other government departments and most ministers, their main objective is to make the case for more spending in their area. And so having something simple like a fiscal rule that the Treasury can make clear to other departments, if you do want this money, then the money has to come from somewhere else, is quite a useful function that it serves. In principle, you don't necessarily need a hard rule or a kind of very specific rule to deliver those sorts of benefits that I was just talking about. And some other countries don't have a rule. Some countries like Canada have what they describe as a fiscal anchor, which is a more loosely described fiscal objective. So there they have an objective that debt should be falling as a share of GDP over the medium term, rather than having a quantified target in a particular year. That is an approach we actually, when we looked at that in more detail, found that in practice it seemed to be ending up being operationalised quite similarly to our more concrete fiscal rules in the UK. So I was less convinced that there really is a very different option available that isn't something that looks like the kind of fiscal rules that we've had in the UK. But as I say, clearly things are not working well in practice, even if in theory fiscal rules make sense. So the set of things that we thought could be done to help improve the functioning of the fiscal rules and the fiscal framework in the UK, just to give sort of brief headlines of this. In terms of the fiscal rules themselves, we suggested 3 changes to try and offset some of the worst behaviours in the past. all those have actually now been done by this government, so I'm open. We can discuss later on the extent to which any of these have made a difference. But so the three things we suggested there were firstly treating investment differently from current spending, and so the new fiscal rules do that. They have a current budget target, not a total borrowing target. Secondly, that the targets should be specified as ranges rather than points to try and get away from this tendency to fiscal fine-tune in response to forecast changes. So at the moment, the government's rules are a point target, but in a couple of years' time, when they have a target that's binding in 3 years, not 5, they are actually going to start using it as a range target, so plus or minus 0.5% of GDP on the current budget rather than a 0 target. And finally, we said that the target should bind more quickly than the 5 years that we had under the previous government. And this government is indeed moving itself to a position where it will target the 3rd year, not the 5th year. And the reason we thought that might be helpful was to avoid the scope for quite so much of the sort of fiscal fiction that we've had in previous times. But the other things I think are needed to sort of make sure that the wider fiscal framework and the way these rules are operationalised actually leads to better outcomes is firstly that the Chancellor, the Prime Minister need to have a comprehensive fiscal strategy. These fiscal rules can only ever be a summary of the fiscal outcomes you're trying to achieve. So you need a more comprehensive strategy, not just targeting the letter. Secondly, really only have one fiscal event a year. Happy to discuss the role that you might want, the challenge of having 2 forecasts, but only one fiscal event a year. And thirdly, needing a regular cycle of spending reviews, setting multi-year spending plans to avoid the behaviours of penciling in totally implausible spending numbers for the later years. Leave it there.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Lots of food for thought. This is very much the view from the economists, but what about the view from the markets? Over to you, Helen.
Hi there, and thank you very much for inviting me to join this. It's great that the markets are featuring. They are absolutely important to all of this. Now, I'm going to look at 3 stages to this about the role of the OBR, about the political as well as economic responses, and then looking forwards, what's going to happen. If I start first then with this, the role of the OBR, I think we made one of our very poor interns have to listen to the spring statement and count how many times Rachel Reeves said the word OBR, and I believe it was 17. She used working people 15 times. So there you go. That's where she ranks the OBR. And we all know about the centrality of this, well, frankly, relatively new part of the UK's fiscal infrastructure, if we're looking on a historical basis. I mean, it's been 15 years, but that's not that long. And where we've got to is, it was interesting after the January gilt episode that Darren Jones, in the Treasury Minister, had said, you know, we all have PTSD about Liz Truss. And I think that comment was actually very revealing and important about this institutional framework, because what seems to have happened is a kind of reductio ad absurdum that Rachel Reeves must not be jettisoned by markets like Liz Truss. And therefore, the logic goes, please the OBR, you please the market. And while I understand that conclusion, it has created and is creating a rather negative feedback loop. So let me just set out how it looks at the moment. So please the OBR, please the markets. Well, the OBR spits out a number, frankly, in terms of are you meeting your rule or not on the pre-measures basis. The government then goes away and thinks about, in terms of its priorities, how it would like to deal with that and whether it wants to restore headroom, as we've just seen in this spring statement. There are tweaks, and then you get to the point where it's sort of tick, you've passed it. The OBR says, you know, you've more than a 50% chance of meeting the rule, and that should mean a calm market reaction. That satisfies that logic. Please the OBR, please the markets. But what that does is well, there are two elements to this where that creates embedded risk in the whole process. The first is that it's not as simple an iterative process as it sounds, because that tweak in the middle where there's a response from the government is a political decision, and it uses political capital. We have started to see this happening in the polls, where obviously Labour have fallen back since their election result. You've seen front page of the newspapers after the spring statement with phrases like balancing the books on the backs of the poor. Whatever we might think as economists to any of this, it's quite clear political capital is being used by the changes are being made to welfare reform. So, you know, that this iterative process is going to continue to use up political capital if headroom needs to be restored and if many factors continue to go against the government. So that's one part of this, which is not unlimited, the political capital. But the other part is that output where market reaction, which has been relatively stable so far, mostly because, and I hosted a roundtable with a number of gilt investors a couple of months ago, and they said, it's fine, they'll do spending cuts, we're not too concerned. But as we've just said, they cannot keep doing spending cuts. They may need to turn to tax rises, etc., etc. But that is endogenous back into the OBR. I've drawn an arrow on my own chart here to get over to this. The market is part of the OBR's forecast. You can see in their sensitivity analysis, they talked about a 0.6 percentage point move in gilts would remove all of the fiscal headroom that has just been restored. Well, we've had that move cumulatively since October. The range for gilts was about 100 percentage points. So it's, you know, well within the realms of possibility that the gilts could move again and shift this. So if you've created sort of a loop, you've closed the loop, you're saying the market reaction must be stable, but market numbers go back into the OBR's model. And what this means is the government is reactive. It's not getting ahead of the curve. The market can be in the driving seat, not the government. And I go back to another comment Darren Jones made after the January gilt market wobble. He said, only the OBR's forecast can accurately predict how much headroom the government has. That again is a very revealing comment. For a start, fair play to the OBR as any forecaster. All forecasts, you know, are prone to not being 100%. I think the OBR has struggled as much as anybody. But it also, again, it belies this misunderstanding of the logic. The market assesses a government's ability to finance itself, not a particular arm's length body. That's what financial markets do all the time. They might say, the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England might not meet its inflation target. That's what the price of a bond will reflect at all times. So this is now embedded that the market is endogenous to the loop and that the government are not ahead of the game. Now, moving on, sorry, I haven't got much time, sorry. So I'll go just political capital being used up. The drop, there was latest polling from More in Common showed Labour on 21%. They were obviously now dropped about 13 percentage points, or at least 10 percentage points since the election. That is actually the same percentage point drop as the Boris Johnson government, and 6 months after that, Boris Johnson was gone. Not to say that the government will suffer the same fate, but it is not something that can easily be ignored when we're saying that the political choice is part of the process for meeting the rules. Now, the third part to this is, we've got the very thin sliver of headroom and how precarious the position is. Now, that's not just been the case for Rachel Reeves. It was the same for Jeremy Hunt. It's what happens, of course, when you get to 100% debt to GDP and any sensitivity to moves in interest rates are going to potentially worsen that situation, which means it's a precarious position at the same time as being at risk to market volatility. Now, the one thing I'm sure people may well ask this today, we've just seen what can happen with the Liberation Day announcements to market volatility. Shocks could come from anywhere and everywhere. If you've got a precarious position, even if you meet targets, but the underlying sliver of headroom is small and volatility rises, then you're leaving yourself very vulnerable. So what we now have is political capital used up, precarious fiscal position, volatility in markets increasing, and the market itself is part of the verdict on whether the government can sustain its own fiscal position. What that gets you to is kind of a target. If the government has now embedded its reaction function that it only operates at the end of the OBR process by tweaking, it can't get ahead of the game. And financial market players look for these, what we call convexity moments, where in fact, you just heard from Gemma talk about a fiscal limit. It exists for every government, whereby once you go through that level, that debt interest cost or lower growth or whatever it looks at, R greater than G, gets out of control. And so some financial market speculators will deliberately pressure that point. It's like having an exchange rate peg, or, you know, the ERM in the 90s, or, you know, anything else. The financial markets just like to, you know, target, you know, exchange rate pegged regimes, for example, that kind of thing. The Swiss franc was one example of that. So I actually am very concerned, since we last spoke, or spoke with you all in January, that the actions taken in the spring statement, the fall in political capital for the government, and this deliberate reactiveness to the OBR, are creating a target on the government's back that market players will at some stage go for. Therefore, sorry to sound doom and gloom, but one has to assess the risky reality of what faces us. In a more volatile market environment, the chances of a more severe fiscal crisis and a vulnerable market meltdown of sorts are increasing. And so I would just, you know, what I wanted to put in here to you all is that while I hear a lot about how the fiscal, and there's some great discussion already about how fiscal rules should work, going forwards, it's got to be a lot more about what Gemma mentioned, a winning of the fiscal argument. The market has to be, it's not convinced about basis points here or there. It is, are you taking the correct strategic direction that we have faith in, or do we need to charge you a greater risk premium? And all of the actions of the government so far are simply adding to a greater risk premium and not dealing with this question of market credibility. So I'll leave it there. I'm sure we'll have questions and move on.
Thank you very much, Helen. You have me very worried now. I'm kind of hoping that Adrian will relax that worry. We'll see. Adrian, it's over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you, Gemma and Helen. There's a lot there I really enjoyed and agree with. So I'll try not to repeat those points, though I think, as they often say, you know, everything has been said, but not by everyone. So let me start with this point, which is that the objective of fiscal policy, that's certainly what we at NIESR have argued for a long time, is to help create conditions for growth, productivity, and living standards, while also ensuring fiscal sustainability. So it's about objectives in a way that makes sure that the public finances are stable. And the role of policy, more generally, is to absorb shocks and to reduce uncertainty. This is really, really key, which is why we think institutions such as the OBR are really important. They can add to this function of reducing uncertainty and absorbing shocks, and we also need credible tools to pursue those objectives of growth, productivity, and living standards. Now, the fiscal framework as it stands fails this test. It fails the test because the rules, again, as they currently are configured, constrain public investment on which growth, productivity, and living standards, other objectives, so clearly depend. That is certainly what I will argue a little later. And secondly, the rules also constrain the ability of government to absorb shocks, for example, the Trump tariffs. So we have a fiscal headroom on the 26th of March, which now may very well evaporate in a matter of days because we've got another exogenous shock, the one I think we could have all anticipated. And why does this also fail? It's because now, again, the rules as they stand exacerbate uncertainty when they should reduce it. We are now going to be speculating for the next 6 months until the budget about which taxes will go up, which spending will be cut. And that is simply no good way of conducting policy. So we have policy that is essentially bookkeeping and targetary, leaving us in a situation where we fiddle rules or fiddle policies or fiddle both at once. Not a good space for economic policy making at all. And surely the state of the country, public services, levels of investment are one indication that this is not working very well. So let me be more specific about the rules, what isn't working. Then I'll move on to the 3 reforms that we at NIESR have advocated for some time. So the rules are arbitrary, as already mentioned by Gemma and Helen, because they're essentially subject, and they're also subject to electoral calculations or assumptions about the business cycle. They've produced a trade away from public investment more towards government consumption, which doesn't help to raise trend growth or increase productivity or boost living standards. The rules have also reduced the fiscal policy debate to speculations about the size of the government's fiscal space. Again, that is not really the key debate. And finally, and perhaps most crucially, they've diverted attention from a frank assessment of the failures of policymaking. You know, we have a structural deficit, we have deep disparities of wealth, health, and living standards across the country. Surely they're the things we should be aiming to correct, not just, you know, whether the rules can be tweaked here or there. So let me just say something about the problem with rules. So rules and targets are essentially dominating fiscal policy rather than discretion and objectives. Now, a rule requires a target to develop a reaction function that maximizes wealth. Again, Helen has already alluded to that. But let's be clear, any good rule has to be applied with some discretion because there's either news or shocks. We have more generally a lack of perfect information, and we also have an absence of perfect tools to meet our targets. So yes, we want rules as pre-commitment, as a sort of strategy to establish credibility, but what we don't want is rules that essentially are like KPIs, rules that in the end just lead to managerialism over actual policy outcome. And yet we've had a lot of that. So just to make the point, why are the rules arbitrary and dysfunctional? We've been changing the goalposts since 1997. Fiscal rules have changed frequently and have often coincided with the prospect of missing targets. So as the former NIESR director Adrian argued, they're more honored in the breach than the observance. Again, not a good space. Rules and policy churn. Since 2010 alone, there have been 8 different sets of fiscal rules and as many, if not more, growth plans. We're fiddling rules, we're fiddling policy, it's not working. Thirdly, they're non-credible promises. Again, something Helen, I think, argued as well. 5-year horizons mean that governments can claim to meet the targets via unrealistic tax and spending plans in years 3 to 5. Now, even if more recently, the fiscal rules are binding in the 3rd year of the forecast rather than the 5th year, they are treated like gods rather than guides. They are just constraining public investment when we need more of it. So the fundamental problem is we're conflating instrument with objective. So we think we have to focus on objectives, growth, productivity, living standards, and others. And in order to meet those objectives, we need public investment. And public investment, particularly public R&D, but also infrastructure investment, can generate positive spillovers into the private sector. So they can crowd in rather than crowd out business investment. And clearly, what we want from rules is to try and increase business sentiment and returns to investment by having the right sort of public investment projects that are productivity enhancing, infrastructure planning, some of the things which the government, to its credit, is attempting to do. Now, how would you reform the fiscal framework as it currently stands? Well, the first thing is to look at the investment rule brought in at the last budget. It specifies a debt measure that doesn't really leverage the value of non-financial assets, including infrastructure. So this rule, again, is likely to constrain public investment in productivity-enhancing initiatives just when we need that. So we have to look at changing the debt rule to reflect the value of non-financial assets and take into account how well-directed public investment can and indeed does raise GDP more than the initial increase in debt. But often it does so beyond the 5-year horizon. So that is the other constraint. The 5-year rule really doesn't work very well at all if we want to take into account the impact of public investment projects. Second reform, we do think that the OBR is an important institution, as I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks. But of course, the way institutions operate can always be improved. So in terms of the OBR forecast and analysis, they should include an overview of the government balance sheet and changes since the previous year, and how that government balance sheet is sustainable in terms of market demand for gilts, Again, a point I think mentioned by Helen, but also the tax revenues that are required in excess of the returns from any assets that are held. In other words, we need from the OBR a frank judgment about whether on current policies debt is sustainable or not. That is really the key question. Not 3 or 5 years, but just more fundamentally, are we on a sustainable path or not? And the third reform we've advocated is to really stick to one budget, to one fiscal event, which again, to its credit, the government have sort of done by not having lots and lots of new tax and spend announcements at the spring statement. But then again, it was, you know, almost like a mini budget, because some tax and spending things were indicated and were sort of, you know, trailed already in the run-up, the welfare reforms and others. So we would really want the government to stick to a single budget in the autumn, and then in the spring have a State of the Economy speech. The State of the Economy address would set out where the economic and social welfare is at, what the goals are for the next year, and then the budget would include an assessment of national progress towards these goals and how changes to tax, spend, and debt can help the country achieve higher welfare. That is the key thing fiscal policy should surely aim at. So working from objectives back to the appropriate instruments. That is the reform we need, and that is what we've tried to argue in this space. Let me leave it there. Really looking forward to the questions and the discussion.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and thank you all our speakers. We do have a few questions in the chat, but before we go to them, I would just like to ask the question that Gemma challenged us to ask about how do you have one fiscal event while you're having 2 OBR forecasts, which I guess is relevant to what Adrian said as well.
So I'm happy to start on that since I posed the question, but when we wrote our paper a year or so ago, we tentatively floated the idea of should we just have one OBR forecast a year to support government only changing fiscal policy once a year. In principle, I think it ought to be the case that a Chancellor should feel able to stand up at a spring statement, present a new forecast and say, on the basis of this forecast, I may be off track on my rules. If things still look like this in the autumn, then we will take action then, but we're not going to do something now. I think in practice, I guess the most recent spring statement showed how difficult Chancellors find it to stand up. And in fact, I think had Rachel Reeves stood up and done nothing apart from confirm the aid to defence switch in spending, she would actually have been just the right side of her fiscal rules. And yet, for some reason, she felt the need to restore exactly the £9.9 billion of headroom. So in light of that, I suppose I'm more inclined to think perhaps we should just have one OBR forecast a year. That's enough for making long-term structural policy choices. In the meantime, you get forecasts from the Bank of England and other city forecasters to give a bit of an update on what's going on, but without having that sort of official OBR forecast that pushes governments to feel they need to do more.
I think if I can jump in just to say, I think that it created this sort of it re-emphasized this feedback loop, and I think the reason she felt the need to do it was that it wouldn't. She could constantly try and claim she was, you know, not only meeting the rule but meeting it by more. I think it was because of what happened in January. I think that really shocked them. I think that Liz Truss PTSD went across all politicians of all parties, very understandably, but it has led to something of an overreaction in that micromanagement of market moves. You know, the market can absolutely cope with once a year. There's this budget, there is this forecast. As you say, there's plenty of other forecasters. The market itself should be making these judgments. And that still would leave space if there were a true shock. You know, of course, the Chancellor can come back any time and say, well, I've got to respond to this shock and I've asked for a quick summary from the OBR. Whereas, yeah, if you put it in the diary and you make it like that, then you're tempting the market to make a judgment on you. I think if we hadn't had the Truss episode in the PTSD, I don't think it would have, you know, she might have just let it run, as I think it was institutionally originally designed to do.
Thanks, Adrian.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. We either have a choice, either we just say explicitly one forecast at the time of the budget and leave it at that, or, as I was trying to say towards the end of my remarks, we broaden and deepen some of that analysis by the OBR and say, let's look at the government balance sheet. How has it changed since the previous year, and how is it sustainable? Rather than just a forecast that essentially ends up telling us what the fiscal space is. I don't think the fiscal space is the key problem. It's not really what we should be obsessing about. So let's take a broader, deeper view of fiscal sustainability. Surely no one is going to suggest that fiscal sustainability is reducible to, is the headroom 5 billion as opposed to 9.9 billion? I mean, it's just not a debate we should be having. It might generate wonderful newspaper headlines, but surely that is not what we should be doing. So one forecast or else a different forecast. But I agree, two identical forecasts is not really working.
Fantastic. Thanks, Adrian. Okay, I'm now going to go to the chat, and Stephen Gregson has 3 questions. Stephen, can I ask you to just choose one of them and ask the question?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'll do the first one, please, actually. So, to what extent do you think there might be a risk of a democratic deficit, perceived or otherwise, if UK government of any persuasion has its policy wings clipped because of a concern about the opinions, judgments of unelected bodies such as the OBR? And I know we're not directly talking about this, but potentially also the Bank of England.
Thanks, Stephen. Anyone want to come in? I mean, Helen mentioned political capital. Adrian is our politics expert, so maybe one of you.
I'll just jump in with well, yes, their perception is always a great risk. I mean, the Conservative government the Treasury Select Committee were, critical of the Bank of England for its failure to deal with inflation. It's an age-old question, isn't it, in terms of how should it be down to 9 people in a room to judge an interest rate, or should it be down to the elected government? Well, we've actually tried both. Obviously the Bank of England wasn't independent prior to 1997, and we have had mostly better inflation outcomes since. So I think that we will never avoid that kind of perception when outcomes are unexpected and the public are unhappy with them. But I think that's why I was talking about the OBR kind of not being that old, really, in 15 years. You need these institutions to be around for a very long time, to run through many shocks, many crises, many cycles. And I think you'll always run the risk of the criticism, but if the institution is credible over the long term, I think you can weather that criticism.
Thanks, Helen. As a member of a fiscal council, the one in Ireland as opposed to the one in the UK, I'm very pleased that you think there is a role for unelected bodies to at least endorse or not the forecasts that would otherwise have come from the government. That's my thoughts on that one. Adrian.
Yes. Look, I think the key thing here is not to think that there is a panacea that somehow either totally unelected bodies only or elected politicians only, will come to the best judgment and decisions. I mean, this is just, a wrong sort of binary, and we shouldn't have to choose between the two. What's really vitally important is to remember that the OBR is accountable to Parliament, and that, regularly, the head of the OBR appears in front of the Treasury Select Committee, and indeed the Lords Select Committee too. So there is accountability. The idea that such public bodies are not accountable, I don't think is true. It's important that Parliament plays its role and scrutinizes both government and these bodies. And if there are ways of strengthening parliamentary accountability and scrutiny, then that's certainly something we should explore. But the idea that we don't need unelected bodies because somehow politicians will always get it right, I mean, that just doesn't, it's not borne out by history, and it's very, very unlikely to happen going forward. So no, we do need them. We do need parliamentary involvement. And I think, we also want to balance political judgment and decision, because we do live in a parliamentary democracy on the one hand, with expert advice, with input by experts. We don't want a pure technocracy, but nor do we want, a purely political system either. There has to be balance. And after all, the UK is a mixed constitution. So let's try and be true to that mixed constitution and have a good balance. We can do better, but the abolition or the curtailment of the OBR would not be the answer to our fiscal woes.
Thanks, Adrian. Sorry, Gemma.
Just to add to what Helen and Adrian said, I mean, all the OBR is doing is producing a forecast, and that forecast is more transparent, therefore more open to scrutiny than what we used to get from the Treasury, and it's more credible and less subject to political wishful thinking in those forecasts. But all they are doing is producing a forecast and saying, if you go with this policy strategy, this is what it will mean for borrowing and debt and other measures of fiscal sustainability. And then it's not in any way constraining the government's range of action. The government can do exactly what it wants to do. The reason we end up finding governments appearing to be very reactive to OBR forecasts is firstly because they leave very little headroom against their fiscal rules, and also because they've tended to behave in a way as if the rule itself is the objective, whereas, as Adrian very well set out, the objective should be fiscal sustainability, fiscal credibility. For some reason, that seems to have got boiled down into literally meeting these rules by very fine margins on the grounds that that is what is needed to reassure financial markets. And I think, as Helen very ably set out, the reality is that that probably isn't it. And a government that instead set out a more serious fiscal credibility strategy, thinking about long-term policy that's consistent with that, might actually both not be as reactive to an OBR forecast and potentially be more credible with markets.
Thanks, Gemma. We've just been talking about forecasts, so that's a very neat segue into what looks more like a comment from Paul Fisher rather than a question. Paul, can I hand over to you?
Yeah, well, it is a great question, because it seems to me that we're having the wrong debate by focusing on fiscal outturns. And I can't see the point about forecasts is they're incredibly uncertain. The confidence intervals are huge. We can't forecast GDP growth a couple of years ahead. We struggle to forecast PSBI outturns 3 months ahead. And yet the whole of the fiscal regime is based around that. And I don't see how any improvements which are just around that sort of framework is going to work. Why aren't we having a debate about things like what should the tax take in the UK economy be? What sort of size of public expenditure as a share of GDP should we expect to have? That seems to me a much more sensible political debate. Then you can measure whether or not you're achieving those objectives and have some control rules over time to meet them, but you wouldn't necessarily be focused on annual fiscal events to make all the adjustments. You'd have to be clear about what your reaction function is, which bits of expenditure or taxation were you prepared to adjust, for example. We don't seem to be having any of these useful debates. And that's not to say I absolutely agree with actually everything the presenters have said. It's just, where do we go from here? And it seems to be we're missing the fundamental debate about the real political choices.
Thanks, Paul. I don't know if anyone wants to come in on that. I mean, I basically agree 100% with that, but I don't know if we have anyone who wants to challenge that.
I suppose I would say that I agree we should be having that debate. We should be, but it's a very thorny one about well, if you want to boil it down to a political philosophy about what is the role of the state. I mean, actually, Rachel Reeves did this in her May's lecture that she gave before, it was in March 2024, which you probably saw, saying that, in fact, New Labour hadn't gone far enough. It looked quite radical, her May's lecture. But, the reality of what's happened since being in government is almost entirely different to that. I think we're going to end up having this debate, but it might take a bit of bolder political communication by all the political parties about, frankly, what their economic philosophy is and what they believe delivers productive growth long term. And sadly, I think we will get there via a crisis, but I think we will get there.
Maybe it's a case of the reason that everybody harps on about the fiscal rules is because that does give governments the opportunity to avoid the bigger questions. Adrian, I know you want to speak, but I'm going to move on to the next question, if that's okay. It's Aloysius Lip. Aloysius, could you unmute yourself and ask a question?
Apologies, Stephen. I'm not actually in a position I can read out the questions. Would you be able to do it for me?
I can read out your question, which was for Adrian. Can you recap how the current fiscal rules incentivize government consumption over investment, given that the binding stability rule targets current spend?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a really good question. I suppose, they do so indirectly because whenever there is a shock and, the fiscal space or headroom is wiped out, the things that are going to be cut will be capital spend, will be public investment rather than current spend because it's politically more convenient. And the argument is, well, we don't really see the effects beyond the 5-year horizon. So why should we be committing to projects that might have a return and add to output, beyond the 5-year horizon? So it's the 5-year horizon that is the problem with the way that we think about public investment. Also, as I said earlier, it's the fact that we do not take into account non-financial assets. If we were, then there would be a better balance between consumption, spending, and public investment. And I think the government is now trying to reduce some of that. You look at their civil service, their proposed cuts to civil service spend, some of the welfare reforms, whether we're for or against, the government is clearly thinking that the share of government consumption is quite high, and maybe there's a way of reducing it. Again, the debate we really need to have is which public investment projects add to output, whether it's in 2 years, in 5, or indeed in 7 or 10. That is really the more critical debate to raise trend growth, to increase productivity, to boost living standards. If we just talk about fiscal headroom and sort of the day-to-day spend, and we do it annually rather than over longer horizons, it just doesn't work. As I think both Helen and Gemma, said so clearly, that is not where the debate should be at. The debate should be about some of the longer-term choices. And I think this goes back to Paul's point. Absolutely, we should be having those fundamental questions. What are we trying to achieve? Growth, productivity, living standards, transition to net zero, and then work backwards. What are the best instruments to get us there? And just the rules as they currently stand constrain us unnecessarily. We're in favor of stable public finances, but we don't have to adhere to those rules in the way we've done. It just simply doesn't help with the pursuit of the objectives.
Thanks. Gemma, Helen, would you like to add, or should we move on? Okay, I'll move on. It's interesting, actually. Alois just had a follow-up question, which was, in October, the government increased public investment by £100 billion, which puts it at its highest level since the 1970s. Both the Treasury and the OBR, and indeed NIESR, put out projections which showed that this would lead to higher growth in the future and crowding in effects. Yet, business sentiment surveys completely unaffected by it. Almost that business doesn't care. So the big question is, how does that sort of lack of response from business, if you like, compare with our narrative, which is that public investment is needed and is a good thing via crowding in? Anyone want to?
Can I ask a question, actually? And perhaps,
yes.
You or Adrian could answer, but I thought that the investment from the October budget showed crowding out in the first 5 years, although it did show that is wonderful 75-year graph where it did show more crowding in. So I don't know if I'm right on that. Then is it that again this sort of 5-year element has just stopped people looking at that, and it's a big, what is it, 130, 180 page report? I don't know. Is that what it is? That the thing? Did that? Am I right in that long-term chart showing?
You are.
Yeah.
Absolutely correct on that. Yeah. So I mean, and that's indeed what people focused on, that there was crowding out in the shorter run. So again, maybe the 5-year target is pushing the debate into the wrong place. I have to say, it is about 130 pages. It's a good read, though. I mean, it's 130 pages you can actually read without wishing to put it down. But anyway, there you go. Gemma, the IFG are very much on shorter targets to deal with the fiction element of government projections. I mean, how does that square with the need to look longer term when we're thinking about public investment?
Yeah, so one of the other recommendations we made, which the OBR has now done, including in that October report, our suggestion was that as well as presenting the 5-year impacts where relevant, they should show the longer term impacts of policies as well, to show where things are having payoffs beyond the 5 years. So that was our suggestion for how to get a bit more focus on the longer term. I mean, I think the perhaps ways that they could make that more obvious, perhaps have put that figure as the first one in the report about the impacts of the investment spending rather than it being somewhere buried later on. But it is difficult to shift the sort of very embedded media focus on the sort of 5-year fiscal targets.
Thank you. Let's move to another question. Until recently, Director Jagjit Chadha has a question. Jagjit, are you able to unmute yourself and ask your question?
I may be able to. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you.
Oh, very good. Well, I've really enjoyed the seminar. Congratulations to everyone. I was simply trying to say, what if by relatively small changes in the tax base, VAT, income tax, or land taxes, you could not only cure the UK of its structural fiscal deficit. No one seems to talk about that, but I think we have got a structural fiscal deficit. And at the same time, that would allow monies to come forward to be put into the economy. And I want to question the distinction between capital and current expenditure. There's a lot of current expenditure that also helps future capacity. One can only point at education and health for that as well. So the distinction is a little bit arbitrary. And we need to be careful in just thinking that all capital expenditure will help the capacity. Some of it won't. It has to be very well targeted and managed. And we seem to have dropped the idea of guardrails on capital investment. So one of the reasons business may not have responded well to the capital injection that we saw paraded in the budget was that people weren't quite sure where that was going and how it was going to be managed. I should probably stop there, but thank you very much for asking me to ask my question. Oh, by the way, I think it was in 1975 that Tony Benn brought in a statute saying the government must produce 2 forecasts a year. So if you want to unwind the 2 forecasts a year thing, then we have to change the statute, I think. But thank you all very much. It's been lovely to hear this debate this morning.
Thank you, Jack. Would anyone like to respond? I mean, apart from making the obvious point that yes, investment is more than just infrastructure. Education, health is important. Gemma.
So I guess to take where Jagjit started, I think, which I think was suggesting that you could make some changes to taxes to either permanently or temporarily increase the tax take. I mean, absolutely, I would agree. And I think what we've seen too much of in recent years is a lot of tinkering of tax policy to find a few hundred million or maybe a $1 billion here and there to sort of make the numbers add up. What we haven't really seen and do need to see for that sort of longer term question of how much do we really want to spend as a state and where are we going to get the money from is actually, there are lots of areas of the UK tax system that are very distortionary. If you wanted to raise bigger amounts of money, then you need to be thinking about bigger structural reforms. So things like broadening the VAT base would reduce economic distortions, would raise quite a lot of money that you could then use to redistribute to groups who might be worried about being hit by a VAT increase. And I saw recently, I think there's a case going through the courts at the moment to debate whether giant marshmallows should or should not be subject to VAT. It's just another example of the ludicrous amount of time and money that is wasted fighting these boundaries in the tax system. If we just got rid of them, we get rid of the distortions and save everyone an awful lot of time and money.
Thanks, Gemma. Adrian.
Yeah, first of all, totally agree with what Gemma just said. Again, it's an example of where we fiddle policy, for amounts of money that, frankly, in the end, do not matter. It's like in the run-up to the election, we didn't debate how we might want to adjust VAT, income tax, or national insurance for employees, it turns out. And instead we had debates about how much we're going to raise from, putting VAT on private schools and closing the non-dom tax loop. I mean, these are just not serious debates, and we need to get away from this both politically and economically. I think Doug is absolutely right about the structural deficit, and that looks to get worse, with aging, with climate change and other huge challenges. And again, the debate should really be about how to address that. And I think it's absolutely right to say that a lot of government current expenditure is in fact investment, just like certain forms of investment don't help. So let's then be clear about the effects on output, on productivity, on living standards where we can, and let's privilege those. So yes, the distinction is somewhat arbitrary. The only point I was going to make, or I was trying to make, is there is government current spending, which is just not productive, and we do need to be clear about waste in the public sector. That is really, really important so that we can focus on the fundamentals. So in that sense, there are elements of consumption spending we really should look at very carefully. I think that the start on the civil service is just that, it's a start. If government can be more sort of laser focused on some of that waste, then I think that can be to the good of the country. But I'd like to see rigorous analysis of this, and I think that's what we all are interested in.
Thanks, Adrian. Time for probably one more question, possibly two, but let's go with the one that we definitely have here, which is Kostas Milas. Kostas, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, everybody, and many thanks for your interesting presentations. Now then, the Bank of England reports forecasts, as we know, for up to 3 years, and understandably, these are not great. So why should we force the OBR, for instance, to produce forecasts up to 4 or 5 years, when surely they will be worse than the Bank of England's ones, since they go beyond 3 years? Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, forecasts are basically not very good, even up to 2 years or 3 years. If you're going beyond that, the forecast is going to be very badly wrong. Maybe you should be doing something else rather than just saying, here is our forecast. I don't know. What do the panelists think on that?
I mean, I think seems to be good reasons that the OBR does a longer term forecast than the bank does. The bank is obviously only focused on output stabilisation in the relatively near term, and so 2 to 3 year forecast is fine. Whereas for fiscal policy making, partly you're interested in the short term if you're facing an economic shock and want to know what the appropriate fiscal policy response is, but also you really do need to take a view on the medium term outlook. Like, what is the sustainable stance of fiscal policy? What do you expect to be raising from taxes in the medium term, and how does that match up to what you expect to be the demands on public spending in the medium term? So I think although it's a hard thing to do, I think it is necessary for the OBR, the official fiscal and economic forecast, to have that longer term view.
I agree. It's I guess the further out you get, the more it looks like scenario analysis and what ifs, and the key really is to make the assumptions clear. At the end of the day, as I think it was Helen reminded us, what really matters for fiscal sustainability is what you think the growth rate will be, what you think the real interest rate will be, and you can of course just have a look at how the debt will evolve given different assumptions of those things, and the structural deficit as well. We're almost at time, but I did want to give all of the panelists a chance for a kind of a closing statement, if you like. So let's go in the reverse order of the opening comments. Adrian.
Well, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, for which I apologize, I would just reiterate the fundamental point we've tried to make at NIESR, which is you have to work backwards from objectives. Be clear about which objectives you're pursuing: growth, productivity, living standards, other objectives. Then work backwards to the instruments. And don't worry just about adhering to rules. Meaningful rules are necessary, but not a sufficient element of a fiscal framework that actually tries to improve the welfare of the country. We've got such deep structural problems, structural deficits, gaps in the capital stock across the country. They're the things we should be focusing on. They're the things we should be debating, not the size of the fiscal headspace. It's a nonsense, and we need to move on.
Very forthright, Adrian. Helen.
Well, as you know, I'm fearful that this can only be resolved by a crisis. I think that will actually, we'll see if the OBR survives. I hope it does, but its credibility will be questioned through all of this as well. But actually, I'm optimistic through that, because I think only after a crisis will we get the proper debate that we've heard from Paul Fisher and everybody else about what the sustainable path to growth is.
Helen?
So I think it's been very clear that governments haven't operated fiscal rules in the way that's really consistent with the underlying economic principles of long-term fiscal sustainability. My impression is that the reason they've behaved the way they have is at least partly a feeling that they need to do that to retain credibility with the markets. And so I was actually really struck by Helen's remarks about actually that behaviour can almost make more of a target on governments' backs and make them more susceptible to market reaction. And so I'm actually really hopeful coming out of this that maybe there is a realisation that both what the markets really want and what is kind of good from the fundamental economics actually line up with each other more than we've seen in recent years.
Thank you very much, Gemma. I'd like to thank all of our panelists for some excellent analysis of what is a really important issue. I should say this is something that the NIESR does. We put on these webinars. Of course, they cost money, and all of the analysis that NIESR does costs money. And so I thought it worth taking the opportunity to advertise that we now have individual memberships where you can join these. The cost is £150 a year. The benefits include access to our global economic outlook, including the back catalogue of these, advanced access to the UK economic outlook that we produce every quarter, a full analysis of the monthly data releases around wages, CPI and GDP. You will receive invitations to our governors seminars. The next one is taking place, in fact, next Thursday with Baroness Nikki Morgan. Past ones have included John Pullinger, the chair of the Electoral Commission, Will Hutton, author and columnist, Ed Conway, Sky News, Dame Colette Bowe, past chair of the UK Banking Standards Board, and Joe Paisley, and indeed Gemma as well, I should mention that. You will also get advance notice of high-profile events, such as our upcoming climate lecture on the 15th of May with Professor Sapatha Dasgupta. You will receive a monthly newsletter, and if you're interested, you can sign up on our website. I mentioned the global economic outlook. We've done a lot of analysis within our recent global economic outlooks on the effects of tariffs. So if you want to have access to all of our analysis on tariffs and what they might mean for the UK and the global economy, then yeah, sign up, become an individual member, and you can do that. On that note, I'd like to wish you all a wonderful rest of the day. It's a beautiful day out there, so enjoy, and hopefully see lots of you again at the next big NIESR event. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.